He saved her from the river without thinking, and by sunrise the entire tribe would know his name. The desert evening had that quiet kind of heat that lingers even after the sun drops behind the red mesas. Caleb Mercer rode slow across the open range, the steady creak of his saddle the only sound besides the wind sliding through dry grass. 30 miles from the nearest town and nearly 15 from his small ranch, the land felt endless out here, stretching in dusty waves beneath a sky that seemed too wide for one man to own. Caleb liked it that way. A man who spent most of his life moving cattle across Arizona territory learned early that silence was better company than trouble. His horse, a dark bay named Copper, lifted its head suddenly. The animal's ears turned toward the canyon ahead, muscles tightening beneath the worn leather saddle. Caleb followed the horse's gaze. At first he heard nothing but wind. Then the sound came again, water rushing harder than it should. Spring storms up in the mountains sometimes sent sudden floods down narrow canyons, turning quiet streams into dangerous torrents in a matter of minutes. Caleb guided Copper toward the edge of the canyon trail and leaned forward in the saddle. 50 yards below, the river had swollen into a violent ribbon of muddy water twisting through stone walls. And in the middle of it, something moved. At first it looked like driftwood caught in the current. Then the shape lifted an arm. A person. Caleb swung down from the saddle before his mind had time to argue. Boots sliding on loose rock, he scrambled down the steep slope until cold water crashed against his knees. The current pulled hard, stronger than it looked from above. 20 feet away the figure struggled against the flow, dark hair whipping across her face as the river tried to drag her toward a narrow bend where jagged boulders waited like teeth. Caleb waded deeper, every step a fight against the force of the water. The river grabbed his legs and tried to twist him sideways, but years of ranch work had given him the balance of a man who knew how to stand his ground. When he finally reached her, she was barely holding on to a smooth rock near the bank. Her eyes met his for the briefest moment. Wide, dark, not just afraid of the river, afraid of him. Easy, Caleb said, though the roar of water nearly swallowed the word. He grabbed her arm and pulled, bracing his boots against the slick stones until the current finally released its grip and allowed them to stumble onto the muddy shore. For a long second neither of them moved. The girl sat in the sand catching her breath, water dripping from the strands of her black hair. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her clothing, made of soft deer hide stitched with careful patterns, marked her clearly as Apache. Caleb stepped back a few feet, giving her space. He had spent enough years near tribal land to understand that strangers were rarely welcome. "You're safe now," he said quietly. The girl looked up at him, and instead of relief, something sharper filled her expression. Fear mixed with urgency. She climbed slowly to her feet, glancing toward the high ridges above the canyon as if expecting someone to appear at any second. Then she spoke, her English careful but clear. "You should not have touched me, cowboy." Caleb frowned slightly, brushing river mud from his coat. "Ma'am, you were about to be carried half a mile downstream." She shook her head, panic growing behind her eyes. "You do not understand." The wind shifted across the canyon, carrying with it the faint, distant sound of hooves somewhere beyond the ridge. The girl looked toward the sound, then back at Caleb with a warning that felt heavier than the river itself. "My people will not see it the way you do." The wind carried the sound again, distant hoofbeats rolling across the canyon like thunder still miles away. Caleb Mercer turned his head toward the ridge, his eyes narrowing as he listened. Out here a man learned to measure distance by sound alone. Those riders were still far, but they were coming fast. The young woman followed his gaze, and the color drained from her face. Water still dripped from the edge of her dark hair, running down the careful beadwork stitched along the shoulders of her dress. She looked no older than 20, yet the weight in her eyes belonged to someone who understood exactly what those approaching riders meant. Caleb rested one hand lightly on Kappa's reins, keeping the horse calm while the animal shifted uneasily on the rocky trail. "Your people?" he asked. The girl hesitated before answering, as if each second mattered more than the last. "Yes," she said quietly. "Apache." The word hung in the air between them. Caleb had traded with Apache camps before and crossed their lands many times during cattle drives. Most encounters were cautious but respectful. Trouble usually came only when someone misunderstood a custom or stepped into territory that was not his. He studied the girl again. The deer hide clothing, the turquoise beads, the careful braids woven into her hair. She was not simply traveling through the canyon. She belonged here. "Name's Caleb Mercer," he said, keeping his voice calm. "And you were about to be carried straight through those rocks if I had not stepped in." The girl looked down at the rushing river for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "My name is Nayeli," she said. Then she glanced once more toward the ridge, her voice lowering. "You should leave." Caleb let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Ma'am, I rode 20 miles today, and the sun is nearly gone. I do not plan to outrun a river and a desert night at the same time." Nayeli stepped closer, urgency sharpening her voice. "You do not understand the problem." She gestured toward the water and then toward herself. "You pulled me from the river. You held me. They will see that." Caleb frowned slightly, wiping a trace of mud from his sleeve. "I was keeping you from drowning." "Yes," she said quickly, "but that is not what they will see." The hoofbeats were louder now, echoing across the canyon walls. Caleb could hear several horses, maybe more, their rhythm steady and purposeful. Nayeli moved to the edge of the trail and looked up toward the high ridge where the path curved out of sight. Her shoulders stiffened as if she had already counted the riders before they appeared. Caleb followed her gaze. The fading light of evening stretched long shadows across the stone cliffs, turning the entire canyon a deep rust color. He had seen Apache riders move through this country before, silent and fast, able to cover ground that would exhaust most men before noon. "How many?" Caleb asked quietly. Nayeli did not answer right away. Instead, she looked back at him with a mixture of worry and something that almost resembled regret. "Enough," she finally said. Copper snorted softly beside him, sensing the tension that had crept into the quiet canyon. Caleb placed a steady hand on the horse's neck and listened as the sound of riders grew clearer with every passing second. Dust began to rise along the ridge above them, faint at first, then stronger as the first silhouette appeared against the evening sky. Nayeli closed her eyes briefly, as though a moment she had hoped to avoid had just arrived anyway. When she opened them again, her voice was barely louder than the wind moving through the canyon grass. "They will think you dishonored me." Caleb stared at her, confusion crossing his face. "Dishonored you?" She nodded once. "Our law is older than your towns or your fences, Caleb Mercer." The first rider crested the ridge, his figure outlined by the setting sun, followed by another, and then another until a line of mounted warriors stretched across the high ground above the canyon trail. Nayeli took a slow breath and whispered the words that made the evening air suddenly feel much colder. "And they will come to judge you." The line of riders along the ridge grew clearer as the last light of evening stretched across the canyon walls. One by one their horses stepped into view, tall figures sitting steady in their saddles, silhouettes cut against the red sky, like statues carved from the desert itself. Caleb Mercer stood beside Copper without reaching for the rifle tied to his saddle. Out here, the first movement often decided whether a meeting ended with words or silence. Nayeli remained a few feet away, her shoulders tense, her eyes fixed on the approaching riders with the kind of quiet acceptance that told Caleb she already knew how this moment would unfold. The first Apache warrior guided his horse down the narrow trail with careful control, the animal moving over loose stones as if it had traveled that canyon path 100 times before. Behind him came another rider, then another, until a group of nearly a dozen men spread across the slope above the riverbank. Their horses formed a slow half-circle as they reached the flat ground near the water, dust rising around their hooves in the fading light. None of them spoke. They simply watched. Caleb noticed the details the way a rancher always did when strangers appeared on. Open land. The leather bridles decorated with beads. The feathers tied carefully behind several saddles. The calm way the men sat their horses without shifting or fidgeting. These were not travelers passing through unfamiliar country. These men belonged to the land the way the mesas belonged to the horizon. One rider finally stepped forward from the group. He looked older than the others, with silver threaded through the dark braid that rested over his shoulder. His posture carried a quiet authority that made the others hold their position without question. The man guided his horse to within 15 feet of Caleb and then stopped. His eyes moved first to Nayeli, studying her from head to toe as if searching for signs of injury or distress. Nayeli lowered her gaze briefly in respect before looking back at him. The man's attention then shifted to Caleb Mercer. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the wind to push dust across the canyon floor. Caleb tipped the brim of his hat slightly. "Evening," he said in a calm voice. The older rider did not return the greeting right away. Instead, he spoke a few quiet words in Apache to the men behind him. The warriors listened carefully, their expressions unreadable as they looked between Naeli and the cowboy standing beside his horse. Finally, the older man spoke in English that carried a steady, measured tone. "You are the one who touched her." The words were not shouted or angry. They were simply spoken like a fact placed carefully on the table. Caleb folded his arms loosely across his chest. "I pulled her out of the river before the current carried her into the rocks." The rider studied him for another long moment. His eyes were sharp, the kind that had watched the desert for many years. "That is what she says." Caleb glanced briefly at Naeli, who stood quietly beside the trail, her hands clasped together as though she hoped the conversation would somehow drift in a safer direction. The older man turned his horse slightly so the others could see both of them clearly. He spoke again, this time addressing the group behind him before returning his gaze to Caleb. "The river does not lie," he said slowly, "and neither does our law." Caleb felt the weight of those words settle into the still air around them. He had seen cattle, auctions, and town courts before, but something about the way these riders watched him now felt older than either of those things. The older warrior straightened in his saddle. "My name is Chief Tahoma," he said. "And you, Caleb Mercer, will come with us so the truth may be heard before the tribe." The canyon grew quiet again after the chief's words, but it was not the peaceful quiet Caleb Mercer was used to on long cattle drives. This silence carried weight, the kind that settles over a place when everyone already understands that something important has begun. Caleb rested one hand on Kappa's saddle horn and studied the riders surrounding him. None of them looked impatient. They simply waited, confident that time itself belonged to them out here. Naeli took a small step forward before Caleb could answer. "Chief Tahoma," she said carefully, her voice respectful but firm. "He saved my life. The river was strong today. Without him, I would have been carried downstream." Tahoma listened without interrupting. His horse shifted slightly beneath him, but the chief remained steady in the saddle, his eyes never leaving Caleb Mercer. When Naeli finished speaking, the chief nodded once, slowly, as though acknowledging that the words had been heard. "Yes," he said. "You say he saved you." The warriors behind him exchanged quiet looks, but none spoke aloud. Tahoma's gaze moved from Naeli to the river below, where the muddy current still twisted through the rocks with restless force. Then he returned his attention to the cowboy. "But the law of our people does not change with the strength of the water." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "And what law would that be?" Tahoma did not raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks when the truth he carries has been repeated for generations. "A man who touches an unmarried Apache woman without witness must answer before her family and before the tribe." Caleb let out a slow breath through his nose. "Chief, I did not touch her out of disrespect. I was keeping her from being swept half a mile through that canyon." One of the younger warriors shifted in his saddle as though the explanation did not change anything. Tahoma raised one hand gently, and the movement settled the group again without a single word. "Intent matters to the heart of a man," the chief said calmly. "But honor matters to the people who must live with the story afterward." The wind moved softly along the canyon walls, carrying the scent of wet earth from the riverbank. Caleb could feel every pair of eyes resting on him now, weighing his words the way traders weigh silver on a scale. "So what happens now?" he asked. Tahoma straightened slightly in his saddle and gestured toward the trail that led away from the canyon floor and toward the high desert beyond. "Now you come to the camp," the chief said. "The elders will hear what happened. The tribe will decide what your actions mean." Caleb glanced at Naeli. She stood very still beside the trail, but worry showed clearly in her eyes now. "And if I decide to ride back to my ranch instead?" Caleb asked quietly. The warriors did not reach for weapons or make any sudden moves. Instead, they simply watched the chief. Tahoma considered the question for a long moment before answering. "The desert is wide," he said calmly, "but stories travel farther than horses." He paused, then continued in the same steady voice. "If you ride away, the tribe will still judge the story of what happened here today. It is better for a man to stand beside his own truth when it is spoken." Caleb looked up at the darkening sky, where the first faint stars had begun to appear over the mesas. He had planned to ride home before nightfall. Instead, he found himself surrounded by 12 Apache warriors and an invitation that sounded very close to a summons. After a moment, he reached for Kappa's reins and swung easily into the saddle. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." The riders moved out of the canyon in quiet formation, their horses climbing the narrow trail with steady patience while the last light of day faded behind the mesas. Caleb Mercer rode among them without being rushed, yet there was no doubt about the direction of the journey. 2 warriors rode ahead beside Chief Tahoma, while the rest formed a loose circle that followed the winding trail through the high desert. Naeli rode a short distance away, her posture straight in the saddle, though every now and then her eyes drifted back toward Caleb as if she wanted to speak, but could not find the right moment. The desert night arrived slowly, spreading a deep blue across the sky while the first bright stars began to appear above the dark outline of the mesas. After nearly 3 miles of quiet, riding the land opened into a wide valley dotted with low fires glowing like scattered lanterns in the distance. Caleb recognized the shape of a temporary Apache camp the moment he saw it. Horses grazed along the outer edge of the valley, their shadows moving across the grass while the smoke from several cooking fires drifted calmly into the night air. Children ran between the lodges until they noticed the returning riders and quickly slowed, watching the small procession approach with curious eyes. The warriors guided their horses toward the center of the camp, where a larger fire burned steadily beside a wide circle of smooth stones. Several elders already waited there, seated quietly as though they had expected the riders long before the first hoof touched the valley floor. Chief Tahoma dismounted first, his boots landing softly on the earth as he tied his horse to a nearby post. The other warriors followed his lead, moving with practiced calm, while Caleb slid down from Copper and rested one hand against the horse's neck to steady the animal. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and sage, and somewhere in the distance a drum beat slowly like a quiet heartbeat across the valley. Naeli dismounted last. She hesitated beside her horse for a moment before stepping toward the circle where the elders waited. Caleb noticed the subtle shift among the people gathered around the fire. Some faces showed curiosity. Others showed concern. A few studied him with careful caution, the way a rancher studies a stranger riding too close to his fence line. Chief Tahoma stepped into the circle and raised one hand slightly. The murmurs around the fire faded until only the crackling wood remained. The chief spoke calmly in Apache for a few moments, his voice steady as he explained what had happened by the river. Caleb could not understand the words, but he recognized the moment when several elders turned their attention toward him. One older man leaned forward, his silver hair reflecting the firelight as he studied Caleb Mercer carefully from across the circle. Tahoma finished speaking and then turned toward the cowboy. "Caleb Mercer," he said in English so the entire gathering could understand. "The river carried our daughter close to death today. You pulled her from the water." Caleb nodded once. "Yes, sir." Tahoma continued with the same calm tone. "But the tribe must understand what that act means according to our law." The chief gestured toward the elders seated beside the fire. "They will ask questions. They will listen to Naeli. And they will listen to you." Caleb glanced around the quiet circle where dozens of Apache eyes now watched him beneath the desert stars. Chief Tahoma spoke one final sentence before stepping back from the fire. "Tonight the truth will be heard. Tomorrow the tribe will decide your place in this story." The fire in the center of the camp burned steady beneath the dark desert sky, its orange glow reflecting in the eyes of every elder seated around the circle. Caleb Mercer stood quietly beside Copper, the warmth of the flames brushing against his coat while the cool night air settled across the valley. The murmurs of the camp had faded into silence now, replaced by the slow rhythm of the drum somewhere deeper in the village. Chief Tahoma stood near the fire, his hands resting calmly at his sides while the elders studied the man who had arrived with the evening riders. One of the oldest elders leaned forward slightly, the firelight revealing deep lines across his face that spoke of many winters spent beneath the open sky. He spoke softly in Apache first, and several of the elders nodded as he finished. Then Tahoma turned toward Caleb. "The elders wish to hear your voice," the chief said. Caleb stepped closer to the fire, removing his hat in a quiet gesture of respect before speaking. My name is Caleb Mercer. I run cattle west of the Red Mesas about 20 miles from here. The elders listened without interrupting. Caleb continued carefully. This evening I was riding home through the canyon when I heard the river running stronger than usual. I saw Naeli caught in the current, and I pulled her out before the water carried her through the rocks downstream. He paused, letting the words settle into the circle. That is all that happened. Chief Tahoma translated the explanation into Apache for the elders, and the people gathered behind them. The quiet crowd listened closely, their attention moving between Caleb and Naeli. When the chief finished speaking, one of the middle-aged warriors stepped forward from the edge of the circle. His shoulders were broad and his expression serious as he looked first at Naeli and then at the cowboy. The river may have been strong, the warrior said slowly in English, but our law does not change because of a river. Caleb studied the man for a moment before answering calmly. Then I suppose your law will decide what kind of trouble a man gets into for pulling someone out of the water. The warrior did not smile. Our law decides whether a man has taken the honor of an Apache woman. A faint murmur moved through the gathering. Naeli stepped forward before the words could grow heavier. He did not dishonor me, she said clearly. He saved me. Chief Tahoma raised one hand again, gently quieting the voices behind them. The elder who had spoken earlier leaned toward the fire and spoke again in Apache, his tone slow and thoughtful. Tahoma listened carefully before translating. The elders understand that the cowboy may have acted with good intention, the chief said. But the tribe must protect the honor of our daughters and the stories that follow them. Caleb folded his hat slowly between his hands. So what does that mean for me? Tahoma looked at him with calm eyes that carried both authority and patience. It means the tribe must decide how your actions will be remembered, he said. The chief paused for a moment before continuing. Our law offers two paths when a man touches an unmarried woman of the tribe. The fire crackled softly as every voice around the circle grew quiet again. Tahoma spoke the final words with the same steady calm he had shown since the canyon. One path restores honor through marriage. The other path sends the man away so the tribe never sees him again. Caleb looked across the fire toward Naeli, the desert wind brushing softly through the camp as the meaning of the chief's words settled over the circle beneath the stars. The fire cracked softly in the center of the circle while the tribe remained silent, every pair of eyes resting on Caleb Mercer and Naeli as the chief's words settled into the desert night. Marriage or exile. The two paths hung in the air like the quiet space between thunder and rain. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, the dry dust beneath his boots reminding him that he stood nearly 20 miles from his ranch and surrounded by people whose laws had been written long before the first wooden fence appeared in this territory. He looked toward Chief Tahoma again. You were telling me that saving someone from the river could end with a wedding? He asked calmly. Tahoma did not react with anger or amusement. His expression remained steady, the same calm authority he had carried since the canyon. I am telling you that honor must be protected, the chief said. Our people remember stories for generations. If a woman is touched and no explanation is given, the story grows in ways that harm her life. Caleb glanced toward Naeli again. The young woman stood quietly near the fire, but her hands had tightened slightly at her sides. The light from the flames reflected across the turquoise beads along her sleeves while the desert wind lifted a strand of her dark hair. She stepped forward before anyone else could speak. The story should be simple, she said firmly. He saved me. That is the truth. The middle-aged warrior who had spoken earlier stepped closer to the edge of the circle. His name was Koana, a man known among the tribe for his loyalty to its traditions. He looked at Naeli with a mixture of concern and seriousness. Truth does not always travel alone, Koana said. People add their own shadows to it. Several elders nodded slowly at that. One of them spoke again in Apache, his voice low and thoughtful. Chief Tahoma listened before translating once more for Caleb. The elders say that the tribe must protect both the woman and the story that follows her. Caleb rubbed his thumb along the brim of his hat as he considered the weight of those words. Where I come from, he said slowly. People usually thank a man before they ask him to marry someone. A faint ripple of quiet laughter moved through a few of the younger people standing near the edge of the firelight, though the elders remained serious. Tahoma raised his hand again to quiet the circle. You misunderstand the meaning, he said. Marriage is not punishment. It is one way honor can be restored. Caleb met the chief's eyes. And the other path? Tahoma answered without hesitation. You leave this valley before sunrise and never return to the lands of our tribe. The wind brushed across the camp again, carrying the scent of sage and wood smoke through the quiet gathering. Caleb considered the choice carefully. Then he shook his head slightly. Chief, I did not ride into that canyon looking for a wife. A few of the younger warriors exchanged glances, but Tahoma remained calm. And Naeli did not ride into the river looking for a husband, the chief replied. The firelight flickered across the circle as the elders whispered briefly among themselves. Finally, Tahoma spoke again. There is another way for the tribe to understand your heart. Caleb lifted an eyebrow slightly. What way would that be? Tahoma gestured toward the open valley beyond the fire where the dark desert stretched beneath the stars. A man may prove his honor not only with words, but with courage and respect. He paused before finishing the thought. If you wish to remain free of marriage and free of exile, the tribe may allow you to face a trial that shows who you truly are. The circle grew silent again as the meaning of those words settled into the night air. The fire burned lower as the night deepened across the valley, sending thin sparks drifting upward toward the wide desert sky. Caleb Mercer stood quietly inside the circle of elders while the tribe considered the chief's final words. A trial. The idea moved through the gathered people like a wind across tall grass. Some faces showed curiosity. Others showed doubt. The desert had a long memory, and the tribe did not offer such chances lightly. Chief Tahoma stepped forward again, his voice calm, but strong enough to reach the outer edge of the gathering. The elders believe the cowboy acted without dishonor in his heart, he said slowly. But a man's heart is known not only by what he says, but by what he is willing to face. Caleb listened without moving. And what exactly would I be facing, he asked. Tahoma turned and pointed beyond the ring of firelight toward the dark hills rising on the far side of the valley. Tomorrow before sunrise, the chief said, you will ride into the high desert with one guide from our tribe. There is a narrow pass 12 miles east of here where travelers sometimes lose their way among the rocks. Several of the warriors nodded quietly. The place was well known to them. Tahoma continued, you will ride there and return before sunset carrying a small object that waits inside the pass. Caleb lifted an eyebrow slightly. You are sending me on a scavenger hunt. A faint smile touched the chief's face, though it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. No, Tahoma said. The object is not difficult to find. The difficulty is the journey itself. The elders watched closely while he explained. The path crosses land that tests patience, judgment, and respect for the desert. A careless rider may wander in circles for hours. A man who listens carefully to the land will find the way. Caleb looked toward the shadowed hills in the distance, measuring the challenge the way he might measure a stretch of unfamiliar cattle range. 12 miles through desert rock before sunrise and back before sunset was no small ride, but it was far from impossible. And if I bring back your object? He asked. Chief Tahoma answered without hesitation. Then the tribe will accept that your actions came from honor and courage. You will leave this valley as a friend, not as a man who must answer to our law. Caleb nodded slowly. And if I fail? Tahoma's voice remained steady. Then the elders will return to the two paths already spoken. The circle grew quiet again. Marriage or exile still waited like two distant roads beyond the firelight. Naeli stepped closer to the chief. Who will guide him? She asked softly. Several warriors glanced toward one another, but before anyone else could speak, the middle-aged warrior Koana stepped forward from the edge of the circle. His expression remained serious as always. I will go, he said. The elders exchanged thoughtful looks, and Chief Tahoma studied him carefully for a moment before nodding. Very well, the chief said. Koana turned his gaze toward Caleb Mercer. We leave before the first light touches the mesas, he said. Caleb gave a small nod. I will be ready. The fire crackled softly as the gathering slowly began to break apart, the tribe returning to their lodges beneath the quiet desert stars. Caleb remained standing for a moment longer beside the dying flames, looking toward the dark hills where the narrow pass waited somewhere beyond the horizon. Naeli stepped quietly beside him, her voice low, so only he could hear. The desert does not forgive careless travelers, she said. Caleb rested his hat back on his head, and looked toward the distant hills again. "Good thing I have spent most of my life riding through it," he replied quietly. The desert was still dark when Caleb Mercer tightened the saddle strap on Copper and looked east toward the black outline of the distant hills. A thin line of pale gray had begun to touch the horizon, the first quiet signal that morning would soon arrive. Around him, the Apache camp remained mostly silent, though a few early fires already glowed faintly between the lodges. Koano approached without hurry, leading his horse across the sand with the calm confidence of someone who had traveled these lands since childhood. He nodded once toward Caleb. "It is time." Caleb swung into the saddle, and the two riders left the valley without another word, their horses moving across the cool desert ground, while the first faint colors of sunrise spread slowly behind the mesas. For the next several hours they rode through narrow ridges and open flats where the wind had carved strange shapes into the stone. Koano rarely spoke, but whenever the trail seemed uncertain, he simply lifted a hand toward the land ahead, guiding Caleb through dry washes and hidden paths that twisted between the rocks. By mid-morning the sun had climbed high above the desert, and the distant pass appeared between two tall walls of red stone. Caleb studied the place carefully as they approached. The entrance looked narrow enough for only two horses to ride side by side, and shadows filled the deeper parts of the canyon beyond. Koano stopped near the opening and gestured toward the dark passage. "Inside the pass you will find a small stone shelf," he said. "On that shelf is the object the elders spoke about." Caleb nodded and rode slowly forward into the narrow canyon. The air grew cooler beneath the tall rock walls, and the sound of the wind faded until only the soft rhythm of Kappa's hooves remained. After several minutes the path curved gently, and Caleb saw the shelf Koano had described. Resting on the smooth stone was a small object wrapped carefully in leather. Caleb dismounted, stepped forward, and lifted it in his hands. When he unwrapped the leather covering, he found a simple silver pendant shaped like a small feather. The metal reflected the thin beam of sunlight that reached the canyon floor. Caleb studied it for a moment before wrapping it again and returning to his horse. The ride back across the desert took most of the afternoon, but the path felt easier now that the direction was clear. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the Apache Valley appeared again between the hills, the smoke from evening fires rising gently into the sky. The tribe gathered once more around the same circle of stones where the fire burned bright against the growing darkness. Chief Tahoma stood beside the elders while the people waited to see what the cowboy had brought back from the desert. Caleb stepped into the firelight and opened the leather wrapping before placing the silver pendant carefully in the chief's hand. The elders studied the object for a long moment before exchanging quiet words among themselves. Finally, Chief Tahoma turned toward Caleb with the same calm expression he had carried since the canyon. "You rode the path with patience," he said. "You returned before the sun touched the western hills." Caleb nodded slightly. Seemed like the right thing to do. Tahoma held the pendant up so the firelight reflected across the silver feather. "This symbol belongs to our people," the chief said. "It represents a man who listens to the land and respects the lives around him." He stepped closer and placed the pendant gently back into Caleb's hand. "Tonight the tribe sees that your actions by the river came from honor, not from disrespect." A quiet murmur moved through the gathered crowd. Naeli stood near the fire watching the moment with a calm expression that finally carried relief instead of worry. Chief Tahoma spoke one last time, his voice carrying across the circle and into the desert night. "Caleb Mercer will leave our valley as a friend." Caleb closed his hand around the silver feather and looked once more toward the wide desert beyond the firelight. Out here, a man's story did not travel by the fences he built or the cattle he owned. It traveled by the choices he made when no one else expected him to stay.